Welcome to this session on China in a changing world. So this one is taking a little bit different format to the first session you saw. It's a panel discussion. However, it's going to be much more of a kind of a conversation with a couple of questions that we'll talk through on the panel in an open conversational style. There may be some of you who are China experts in the audience. Some of you who maybe just want to find out about what the hell is happening on the other side of the world. So there's no such thing as a stupid. Well, there is such a thing as a stupid question, but feel free to ask anything that takes your fancy. I was just thinking when the first session was going on that China has definitely changed. I lived in China for 6 years. I was teaching in Suzhou in Jiangsu province, and in those days it was £500 to fly to China. Now it's £6,000 to fly to China because of COVID restrictions, 28-day quarantine to get to Jiangsu province, and so I'm not going to be going back there anytime soon for maybe the next 2 years. It won't be permitted. And the thing is that you had a history of China being unknown to the outside world, and now you've got another situation where China's going back to being somewhat unknown to the outside world. But I think that this session is to take a look at how things have changed in the recent period. How things maybe are changing in the future, how tensions are increasing, as well as just to kind of take a look at explaining some of the mystery of China. There's some seats around, gentlemen, ladies, if you will. Don't stand, please. So it's kind of to uncover a little bit of the facts about China and China's relationship with the world. There are two trends, just to point out, where the West is learning from China, probably more than two, but I'll point out two. One is the discussion on the new normal that we just had. New normal was a phrase which was first used by Xi Jinping in 2015 when he was looking at that expansive, kind of mad, white heat of technology rush of economic development. And suddenly it started to calm down, the GDP rate started to reduce, and he was talking about we have to live with this new normal, maybe a slightly reduced flurry of economic activity. And the second one, in terms of the cultural shift, all the discussion about pronouns in the West these days, and which pronoun do you want to use. The fact that China has a president called Xi is one thing, but the vice president is called her, and it's spelt he. How mad is that? Anyway, so there you go. So what we're going to try and do is have our speakers to respond to a couple of questions. Let me introduce who they are in the first place. In the middle, we have Dr. Li Sun, who's a lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of Leeds. She's an ethnic Miao woman, and she grew up in a remote village in southwestern China. Since 2007, she's lived and worked in the UK, Germany, the US, and the Netherlands, and previously served as a consultant at the United Nations, the World Bank, and the OECD. Her main research interests are in urbanization and globalization. Obviously, one thing we know about China is the mad kind of building of cities, etc. And her book, Rural-Urban Migration and Policy Intervention in China, was published in 2018. In the far end of the table, we have Professor Flora Huang, who's a professor of law and business at Derby Law School. She's published widely in fields of financial and corporate and Chinese law, and is currently working on a book called Chinese and Global Financial Integration through Stock Connect. Don't ask me. Ask her. And that's going to be published next year. She has worked for the United Nations herself, the United Nations Environment Programme, and the Office of Legal Affairs at the UN. She's also an arbitrator at China Guangzhou Arbitration Commission and advisor to the Legatum Institute. And then finally we have Jacqueline Kwan, a freelance journalist, currently pursuing a master's in science communication at Imperial College, having just moved down from Manchester. She first started reporting on China-UK relations in 2019, and in 2020, her story about the rise of anti-Chinese racism was an important feature in the media. You probably read about it somewhere fairly recently. Jacqueline usually covers data stories and science and technology, and has written for Wired magazine and Current Affairs and more broadly. So can we just all welcome the panel, please? That's more than enough. They haven't said anything yet. Right. So first of all, we're going to just start with a couple of topics, as I say. First of all, this year was the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party from 1921. Very famously, in 1919, there was the May the 4th protests, which were all about democracy and science, kind of in some ways, for many people, an unknown aspect of what had gone on in China. So they were on the streets protesting in favor of democracy. Anyway, the rest is history. But President Xi, just on the anniversary, said, "We will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us." Fair enough. Anyone who would attempt it will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel. And that terrified a lot of the Western media. So really we're going to take a look at, in the first question, is just to get your opinions about what is happening in terms of US or China global relations, but also the kind of development of nationalism within China. What actually is going on? How is it changing? And what are the important aspects that you'd like to kind of point to? So who wants to kind of kick off with a couple of points? Flora, go on.
Actually, I know that quite a lot of the people very concerned that the speech made by the President Xi. But actually, the U.S. and the China, the conflict is not because this 100 years, the CCP. When you look at the whole history from Vietnam, North Korea, and Taiwan, it always have a conflict. And in particular, in the Donald Trump the administration, and the Donald Trump increased the tariff on all the China the products, also ban the Huawei company, and arrest the Canada arrest the Huawei the CFO the Meng Wanzhou. And also, I'm not really sure about whether you invest the U.S. the stock or now. Last year, and the U.S. just passed a bill they call Holding Foreign Company Accountable Act.
We haven't got enough to shout out. Flora, louder.
Okay. So it means that last year the U.S. just passed the act. This the act particular for Chinese company listed on U.S. stock market. So if you mean that the Chinese company, if we won't go to the U.S. stock exchange, if in the 3 years you are not able for the SEC, the U.S. the security, not able to check your financial account for 3 years, so you mean that all the Chinese company you have to delete for the U.S. stock exchange. So it is particular for Chinese the company. So you could see that from history, though, now that they always have the conflict, it's not because for the CCP 100 years, 200 years, it's not because. And I think that why it happened, when you look at the economy, U.S. the first largest economy, China the second largest economy. So it's some kind of in China that they say that one mountain you cannot have two tigers. So you think that always have this conflict. But how about in the Biden era? When you look at the Biden, and recently, just this month, and President Xi and the Biden, they say that we have a summit at the end of this year. And also the Meng Wanzhou returned to China. And China is staying for this exemption for all the U.S. products. So you could see the tension a little bit relaxed in the Biden era. So I think this whole conflict is some kind of bumping road. Sometimes very tense, sometimes very relaxed, sometimes a little bit okay. So, and if you ask me what is the future?
We didn't ask you that. God, give a Chinese person any time to talk.
Yeah.
The hind leg of a donkey. Hang on, Flo. Yeah. Right, look. So we got 5 questions to go through. 3 people. Lots of things to talk about. Little time. Right. Hold your breath
finish,
a minute. Right, Flora. I'm going to go around the panel.
Thanks for give the introduction about international relations. I think I will more talk about from the domestic perspective. I have a question. How many of you have been to China before? Oh, that's very impressive. So if you haven't been to China, then I think you're very open-minded global citizen. Thank you for coming to our panel. And for me, as a sociologist, when I do research, I intend to use an evidence-based approach. What means evidence-based approach? That means I often travel to different parts of China, either in cities, in villages. I talk to the people on the ground. I have been doing research in more than 20 provinces of China, like more than half of the Chinese territory I have been to. And every time, no matter where I will be, I ask people, are you happy? They are answering yes. And I have continually, because I have been out of China for almost 15 years, I know the difference of the lifestyle, right? I would think maybe their answer would be no, they won't be happy. But the answer was yes. I was continually asking, why do you answer you are happy? And they are saying, because compared to my parents, compared to my grandparents' generation, our life are very much better off. So that's their life world. That's how they perceive their life course compared to the other generation. But they never ever really compare to the life in the UK, in the US, or in Europe. I guess this is how the nationalism come from, because they compare with their older generation. But although I think there are something we would look at is 700 million Chinese were left out of poverty in the past 4 decades. That's one of the reasons they are confident about the Communist Party. Thank you.
I'm only going to put one little proviso in that. Obviously, one is that rising out of poverty is about $1.50 a day, right? So there's still a lot of poor people in China. Second one is that famous quote that was done in a game show where some young village woman said that she'd rather be miserable in the back of a Mercedes than happy on the back of a bicycle. And that idea about material progress not necessarily bringing happiness but bringing wealth, right, is a very important point you raised. Anyway, Jacqueline.
Yeah, so as a journalist, I think I'm in a quite unique position on this panel because I've probably been plugged into the kind of framings that you all interact with when, you have the BBC, the NBC, all covering China relations. And I think one particular thing that is very, very clear is anxieties about China's threat to Western values, power, and economy. And I think there is kind of a huge anxiety about what kind of threats China does pose. But I think one thing that China definitely does not have a lot of power in is the production of knowledge. So things like media and how people perceive China. So if you are a journalist trying to cover China, everyone knows how difficult that is to try to get, for example, Chinese corporations, Chinese diplomats to go on record and participate in, for example, how we all perceive China. So, for example, in the recent story I covered for The Mill, incredibly difficult to get any corporation to comment about what they think these rising tensions mean for them, and to get, for example, individual students to participate in that conversation. So I think this is a really interesting part to look forward to in the future, whether or not China will ever participate in the production of knowledge about how it's perceived in the world, what role it plays, and whether or not it is seen as a threat, and whether or not that anxiety is actually warranted. But yeah, I think as a journalist, it's incredibly interesting in how we construct China and how we typically outsource a lot of anxieties that we see that we refuse to see within ourselves. So, for example, oppression of ethnic minorities, strong-holding economies. These are all traits that are not necessarily unique to China, but Western media is able to contrive to be just about China. So it'll be interesting whether or not China will ever be able to participate in how the world sees China.
So China's completely hard done by. It's misunderstood and controlled by the Western media, or do they have their own destiny and own objectives?
Yeah, so I think China definitely has a lot of agency in the future, but talking about the production of knowledge and just like how we currently see China, I think at least in the kind of media that we interact with, China definitely does not participate a lot. But there's probably a lot of alternative media that China itself consumes and the rest of the world consumes that China plays a much more active role. And so that's the kind of media that I think we're not very plugged into and we're not very aware of. And so we need to know that other perceptions of China also exist.
That's a fair point. So coming back to your other two, just to say, just deal with that question about the rise of global tensions, right? What is going on? We can talk to your point about the future, Flora. So what do you see now occurring? How do you see it panning out?
I think the relationship between China and the US is a little bit changed. And in the past, it mainly focused on politics. But now that it's more related to the trade, business. So some kind of you could see that a lot of the U.S. tried to ban the Chinese company, and China attacked the U.S. company. So it's more related to the trade war, the business war. But what is the next step? Actually, I don't know.
Okay. Well, no, we can't. We don't know the future, but we can have a bash at trying to work it out. Go for it.
Yeah, and globally, actually, like now we look at the U.S.-China relation, but China now is expanding globally. You can say that Chinese investment in Africa and the investment in even some Eastern European countries, like what we call it One Belt, One Road initiative. So all of these really say China's ambition to engage in the global governance and also expand their power, and I think this is really reshape the geopolitical order in the long term.
But of course, China's been forced or volunteered to pull out of Africa, not building coal-fired power stations, obviously to the detriment of African development, that they're not getting that investment. China is being pressurized a lot by the kind of the environmental conversation that's going on just next week. So President Xi's not attending. And from what you're saying about the Western media, China, from whatever China has done, which is that they're the biggest investors in solar panels, biggest investors in wind turbines, the biggest investors in lithium batteries, they're building eco-cities left, right and center. But at the same time, they're still seen on a pariah level when it comes to the environment. So how does that pan out? And, is China part of the problem, or are they part of the solution? Jacqueline.
This is a very complex question. Probably the real answer has to be the least exciting one, which is it can be both, and it is simultaneously both. That there are many policy interests that China and the rest of the world definitely do align on. But one thing that we're not typically good at grappling, especially in the media, is the multiplicity of those interests, as well as whether or not there are places that we can cooperate, as well as places where we need to hold China slightly more accountable for a lot of more, for example, ethical and social issues. And so this is the problem when we import a lot of reductionist narratives about China from elsewhere. For example, talks about research collaboration and academic collaboration is one that is inherently diverse and has a huge diversity of interests within it. But the problem is that we see China as one homogeneous body, and we treat it like that. So when treating, for example, whether or not to treat Chinese students and Chinese academics with hostility or with openness, I think that's where things start to get a bit muddied when we only talk about one very reductionist narrative of whether or not China presents a problem or an opportunity. Probably it is both, and probably then does need to be incredibly robust safeguards to nudge it towards the opportunity side and away from the threat and problem side.
Okay. Lee.
Yeah, I think every country has their own unique opportunity and challenges. What China is facing is, I'm not saying what China is facing is compared to what Britain facing in a few decades ago, because every country's context is different. But what we are seeing now is the quick policy learning from each other, which is really appreciated by different countries. Like early this month, China started the first cohort of the national park development, and I personally host some Chinese delegation come to the UK to learn your great experience in the national parks. So, which is also one of the initiatives of China's ecological civilization. So I really think those good policy and practice learning could challenge the country's current issue.
By the way, if you want to read about China's national parks, there's a very good book called China's Urban Revolution by me, which explores, well, I had to drop it in, didn't I? Well, but there is a question, right, about how China is dealing with the environmental conversation, because on one hand, I mean, there's a guy called Wade Shepard, an American commentator on China, who said that an eco-city is a contradiction in terms in itself, right? If you're going to build a city and call it an environmental city, then obviously it doesn't make any sense. However, China has developed in the last 40 years what took 200 years in the Western world. So all of that, smokestack industries that were going on in the Victorian period, children up chimneys, people dying of congestion and pollution and what have you, surprise, surprise, that's occurring or has occurred within China. And they've reached an economic development position where they can now deal with some of those questions. And part of that is by introducing parks. In the same way that when you go to Chinese cities, it's quite remarkable that there aren't any parks. There aren't any green spaces. There aren't any seats, right? You can't sit down anywhere. But that's part of the kind of the mad onward rush to develop and create this kind of metropolitan kind of economic dynamism, at which point now they're starting to introduce parks. Obviously, to introduce parks, you have to knock down some of the houses, right, which is equally pissing people off. But generally, there's a movement to having a bit more of a civilized, developed society than was previously the case. Anyway, sorry to go on. Flora.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a small point. And recently,
Flora, see this block here?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Cup his ears. It's like some Victorian ear trumpet.
Sorry.
Right? Louder.
And recently, there have two countries. They propose net zero. One is the UK, Boris Johnson. They said that we have to the net zero by the 2060. 2050. Another is China. China also said that they want to be net zero by 2060. So at the moment, the two countries. But at the moment, I haven't seen from the Boris Johnson that have a step-by-step plan. But now the China, they're working out the plan for the how to towards this net zero by the 2060. So let us wait to see.
That old Maoist slogan. Just wait and see, comrade. No, I think, when China says net zero by 2060, ironically, the response from the West was then to say, well, actually, we'll do it in 2050. That kind of, I'll name that tune in one, right? It's like, we'll now do net zero by 2030, and it's kind of arbitrary dates which have just been kind of set up. Obviously, net zero, what even does net zero mean, right? It means you're planting more trees than you're emitting, or you're offloading your carbon.
But
to
I just
some other country.
in my university, I'm from the Derby University. My university, they have a new build, business school. And then yesterday, when I look at this plan, they said in our building, no car park. Okay, wow. Why the no car park? They say because we have to achieve the net zero. And you have to walk or take the public transport to the building, not by car. So that is net zero.
Exactly, bullshit. So it's a bit like when you go to China, all the kind of Western sustainability consultants kind of moan about the fact that all these Chinese people are driving massive cars, and all these Western environmentalists are cycling around China. And you think, well, it's only been 30 years since Chinese people got off their bikes, right? That's all they had. And now they have the luxury of a car, they're going to use it, let me tell you. So, in some ways, China is playing the system, but the West has created the system, I think. But in terms of the business conversation, since Flora, you mentioned it, again, there's a very intense discussion about should we, that's we in the West, trade with China. China is an authoritarian one-party state. It has all kinds of nefarious things going on the sidelines. And there's a real ethical dilemma about kind of the moral responsibility of universities like your own, right, to do business with China, since China sometimes interferes, as they say, in the curricula. The Guardian had an article saying there's an alarming Chinese meddling in UK universities, and that idea that therefore we need to be much more wary about what China's up to. And that also extends in terms of Huawei, in terms of 5G and all the rest of it, and even the nuclear power plants. So give us your feel about, how Chinese people are responding to this, but how we in the West can deal with this question?
I just give you a few data. And yesterday I checked to update the data. And do you know that this year until March, how many Chinese students in the UK? Just have a guess. How many students? Now it's still in the COVID, right? Just consider in the COVID now.
How many Chinese people are in the US?
Student, Chinese student. Yeah, in the UK.
If you start audience participation, it all goes to pot. You know what?
UK.
You know what referenda are like? 120,000.
And 216,000. But now, because it's still the two countries that still in the COVID, no the direct flight. So if the normal year, like the next year, maybe more students come into the UK. 216,000. You mean now? Just now, in the COVID? They say around 400,000.
How many on average stay resident in the UK or Western countries, and how many travel back to China? Do you know this?
I don't have this number. They just the embassy that provide the number.
Do you have to be politically better before you're allowed to leave China? Are non-communist party members actually allowed to leave China?
You mean am I allowed to go back to China or?
Students, do they have to be vetted by the Communist Party before they're allowed to come to the UK from China is the question?
No.
So are you allowed to be a non-communist party member?
And I think that the UK actually they don't mind, but for the US they do mind.
In China, right, there's 1.3 billion people. There's only 700,000 Communist Party members. It's a very exclusive. There's more Catholics in China than Communist Party members. No, there is. That's why there's only so few. There's a lot of vetting, right? It's an elite subject, so you have to get through. You have to be somebody who's going to represent the party. You're not going to let anybody in. So there's a small number of people who are in the Communist Party. They don't vet people who leave the country. No. I mean, they did, but not anymore. Or at least not to their knowledge. Anyway, sorry, Flora.
Yeah, I mean that. So a lot of the Chinese students that they come to the UK study, and they bring a lot of the money for accommodation, for tuition fee, for living, or for everything. But okay, we don't talk about the student. Now, when we look at the market, and just a few months this year, and the 4 Chinese companies, they buy the 4. Only a few months by the 4 British company, and each year they have 80 billion trading, and also in the 1999, and China was the UK 26th export market, but now just guess now the ranking, which 1990 is the 16th. And how about now? This year?
Is this a quiz? Just tell me the answer.
It's the 6th. It's the 6th largest export market. But in other direction, for the import, is the 4th. So you could see the data. Whatever you like it or not, whatever you want to do in the business or not, this or some kind of trend. So whatever from the private student that come here to study, or for the company themselves, they want to do in the business together. So it's some kind of not depend on the attitude of government. It's some kind of is that we are living in the globalization. So the company they want to make it the business, and also like when you mentioned my book, the stock, so as I hear, and actually the Shanghai Stock Exchange, they build a mechanism with the London. So now if you you're a British investor, you could buy the stock from China. Also the same, Chinese investor, you could buy the stock from London. So I mean that in all the aspects, we are doing a lot of the business.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I appreciate all of that, right? So there's an integrated global market and China's at the forefront. The question still remains whether we should continue that or whether we should influence that in some ways or whether we should be doing deals, same as with Saudi Arabia. Now, should we do dealings? So it's an ethical question beyond just a straightforward business marketing one. But I'll come back to you in a minute. Jacqueline.
Yeah, so I actually covered this because most of you probably know how important Chinese investment is to many northern revitalization projects. So there were a lot of discussions about whether or not this was going to result in meddling in local politics, whether or not China was going to influence many northern universities in a specific way to suppress free speech, etc. So there are ethical questions that exist on a geopolitical and kind of an abstract social political level. But I want to raise how these sometimes trickle down to the realities of interpersonal engagements that business does entail, right? For example, business does entail actually engaging with individual Chinese people. There are academics, there are researchers, there are politicians on the ground. And sometimes when we talk about like high-minded or abstract geopolitical questions, the attitudes that we take can be incredibly hard lines, can be incredibly not very sensitive to individuals on the ground. So a lot of these ethical questions, when you see them discussed in media about whether or not it is ethical to engage with the state, sometimes do translate to, for example, interpersonal hostilities towards Chinese researchers. For example, in the US alone, there was someone who was brought to court under the accusation that they were in academic espionage. They were later found out to be cleared of that accusation. And so I'm not saying that there are things that we shouldn't be cautious of. They do exist, but the way that we handle them ought not to affect how we humanize Chinese people on the ground. And so I think that's something that I think many people handling Chinese relations on the ground are incredibly sensitive to. And I think this is one of the reasons why ethical questions and political questions aren't very easily integrated into safeguards, because they believe that they operate in two separate realms. Business people are keen to just get on, and universities are keen to welcome more Chinese students, and are not willing to engage in very tough social-political decisions if those social-political discussions aren't framed in a way that is sensitive to interpersonal engagements. That is how these business engagements actually do take place in.
Okay, very good. I mean, there was a case in the papers about the Chinese embassy were reported to have contacted Durham University to ask that the Chinese society pressurize the debating society to cancelling a speaker. And that was held up to be typical Chinese, cack-handed interference. Obviously, most UK universities cancel their own speakers quite... They don't need China to help you out on that one, right? So we have to kind of balance the way the conversation's being handled. But Lee?
Yeah, I think the answer is very straightforward. Yes, Britain should do business with China, but we should have a following up question is, how can Britain do business with China rightly? And how can China doing business with Britain rightly? I think rightly really to show what the right approach. Because what China is doing now, every time I spoke to some businessman, for example, British businessman, Western businessman in China, they are really sick and tired of the internet control. They said, we have no access to WhatsApp. We can't contact with families. We can't Google. We can't go to YouTube. Because those internet censorship just make business difficult if any foreign country want to set up company in China. I think really both parties should reflect how to improve and overcome such barriers. By the way, I just give you a very short what we call SAIC country. You know the BRICS country, right? China is one of the BRICS country. Have you heard of the SAIC country? SAIC countries, S stand for Syria, I stand for Iran, C, China, K, North Korea. So ironically, China belongs to the group of BRICS country and SAIC country. So you can say how those businessmen really sick of the internet control in China.
Yeah. not the best kind of business connection, is it? North Korea is a great market for grain. But when it comes down to the question about that ethical responsibility and how we deal with it, the COVID conversation obviously is one which has really hit the headlines. Very famously, it was kind of briefly hinted at in the opening session, but Neil Ferguson, that guy we all love to hate, or just hate. The government advisor said, China is a communist one-party state. We thought we couldn't get away with it, lockdown, and then Italy did it, and we realized we could. Hurrah. So that idea about the liberalism which we put on China, that idea that, they can lock people down. And when COVID happened in China, I happened to be in Wuhan at the start. I didn't bring it over here, by the way, but I happened to be in Wuhan at the time, and that lockdown was pretty fierce. Do you know what I mean? It was literally almost nailing people's doors shut and monitoring you if you ever went out. And we thought that would never happen over here. It didn't happen in the same way, but it has the same kind of effect, especially if you're in a care home. So that illiberalism works both sides, but China is a one-party authoritarian state. Britain is meant to be a democracy, right? So it's kind of interesting to see how those two things have influenced one another, or whether you think they just happen to be coincidental. So do you think that authoritarianism is over here under COVID, is that a Chinese-style victory against democracy, which they're always going to argue against, or do you think that maybe we will prevail?
Actually, I think it's the total different way to deal with the COVID. And do you know that I chat with my family or my friend in China a lot. And every time I say that, we have 50,000 cases per daily, and they're really scared. And they say, how you can live in a world with the virus? I say, I just usually walk, and I go to work every day. I take a train, I take the bus, and I go to supermarket, just live normally. But they very surprised and very scary to see how I live in the UK. Also the same. When I feel the hard lockdown in China, for example, if maybe a few cases in the city, they will lock down the whole city suddenly without any notice. Just said, okay, from now they lock down. And they need to do the test in 24 hours. So I think it's impossible in the UK. How we can learn from China? I mean that this when we learning, so we have to consider whether our system, whether the people, whether like it or not. I think it's a totally different. We cannot learn in China the lockdown. Even you could say that very effective. You could say that very effective because at the moment China maybe only of some city only a few cases, but they still see they try to wipe out the zero. So this the China the target. But for us, we already live with the virus. So very difficult to say that. I mean that each country they have your way to deal with. Like in China, they have a central isolation. So whenever they found some affected cases, they will send you to hospital and to centrally the isolation. But here, when we lock down, so we sell at home. We lock down at home. So we use the different style.
Yeah. No, but just to say, it is, when I came back from China, when the COVID thing first started, I was telling my friends that the shocking stories of people in China, because distances are so great, that old people, because taxi drivers weren't working, buses weren't working, and the idea of people were literally being found dead in their homes, and you thought, this is an incredible, awful situation. And then you think, a year and a half later in this country, you kind of think, well, actually, not the same, but it's gone equally bonkers. So, it's. I think there's a little bit of understanding. But like I say, the fact that it happens in China, a one-party state, an authoritarian society, is almost understandable. In the West, maybe it's slightly less so. But enough from me.
I think learning from other countries' lesson or experience, that's important. And what's more important, need to learn from ourselves lessons. Why China controlled the virus very early on. Can you remember? In 2003, we had the SARS outbreak. And only because of this, China learned the lessons from 2003. I regard it as a past dependency. So they quickly contended because they don't want to repeat the tragedy almost 20 years ago. I believe what will happen in the future, UK can also contain it very quickly because they learned from the current pandemic, COVID-19.
Okay, thanks. Jacqueline.
Yeah. Building on that, I think it's actually interesting to question whether or not the UK will learn from the coronavirus the same way that China has learned from SARS. I mean, I don't think people have even learned from the first wave of the coronavirus. We're all sitting in a room enclosed without masks while cases are at the highest they've ever been. And the reason why we're not wearing masks is because less people are dying from COVID. And so one thing that I want to talk about is something that I have knowledge of. I've been in contact with many Chinese students and looking at how they've received like how their home country is handling the virus versus the UK. And these are students that were never particularly pro-fascism or authoritarianism. They regularly complain to me about the fact they can't use WhatsApp back home, they can't watch YouTube, stuff that they have been acclimated to using in the UK. But suddenly, when it came to assessing the efficiency of different lockdowns, they heralded this as a reason why Western neoliberalism had failed, which is very interesting that they interpreted and framed it that way. I think some of them did seem to have this resentment that material safety and prosperity was taken for granted in many places in the West, that basically things would be okay, and this is the reason why many people have become complacent. While it seemed to them that there was an understanding of collective fragility back where they had come from, that things needed to be sacrificed in order to continue prosperity, to continue security. And so I think looking at that, and I think it's interesting how Chinese students themselves are not necessarily pro-CCP or even pro their political system, but looking at how cultures are different, may be inclined to be a little bit more, I guess, like they just buy the framing that they're given, that this is a victory for the Chinese state, rather than something they've all collectively sacrificed things for.
Very good, very good. Look, so we're going to come out to you now for any of your questions, and there's a million and one things on the table, okay? From internet censorship, which in some ways the West also has a sneaky regard for. In China, they just brought in a new app which actually only allows children to have 3 hours a week on video games. Otherwise, it all shuts down, right? And you just know people think that is sneakily quite a nice idea. Medical records, everything, not you maybe, but and then medical records are all going to be kind of. They've basically said that all medical records should now be face-to-face, stopping with this kind of internet technology. But whatever is being done on the internet, all that medical information will be available to the state. Everything will be available to the state. And also, just remember that there is an economic downturn in China. Yes, that steel production, whether it's on environmental grounds or whether it's on economic profitability grounds, steel shutdowns, heavy industry close downs, energy shortages. There's a 3-day energy strike in Jiangsu province at the moment. So, there's a lot going on, right? So if there's anything you want to find out that you don't know, anything you want to add to the conversation with your own experiences, feel free. But let's just broaden this question out. We just had a little sample here. So any questions? Yes, let me just to say, sorry, I'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time to give these guys a chance to work out which they want to answer best, and then we'll come back out. We'll take you, sir, then you, and then you, sir.
Just a couple of things. I think it's very strange how all three of you seem to have been trying to draw equivalencies between the West's morality and the morality of the PRC, which is, that's just patently absurd. It's obviously such a ridiculous thing to try and pretend that a totalitarian state that is actively engaged in genocide and organ harvesting and ridiculous censorship around the world. Like there was a French art gallery that was forced by the Chinese government to do away with an art exhibit about a year and a half ago, I think it was. And this thing of is it right for companies to do business with China, and your response is basically, well, that doesn't enter into it, right? None of it matters, what matters is business. Just saying that that's how things are isn't really a very good answer. Like I feel like we're in the beginning stages of a Cold War with China, that China's actively fighting, and has been for 20 years, and the West isn't. The West is just not waking up to any of this at all. And you mentioned that chap in America that was cleared for allegations of being spied for the state. That's all well and good, like it's awful that he was wrongly accused, but what about the dozens and dozens of people that have been arrested that are actively spying for the Chinese state, and that there are previously 400,000 Chinese students in Britain? That's terrifying. Like, that should scare everyone in this room. We never would have done this with the Soviet Union or with Nazi Germany, and we're doing it now for the sake of the bottom line. And that's very scary. And as China flexes its geopolitical muscles more and more with the Belt and Road Initiative and investments in Africa, we should all be very scared of a world where China is the superpower.
Okay, thanks. Can I just make one point, and I think Jacqueline will also reinforce it, is that making a distinction between the Chinese state and Chinese people. Yes. So I teach. I have many Chinese students. I'm not scared in the slightest. Yes. Just to make that. I mean, I know what you're saying, and I think it's a valid point. Especially that's the way it's perceived in the West. So just ponder that thought. I'll take a couple more questions and then come back and address it. Take you, sir, and then you.
Yeah, one thing I think is quite interesting to explore is what you've just touched on there, which is how monolithic or otherwise China is. And where I'm obviously concerned that everything that I need to live, food and clothes and things like that, I'd obviously be very concerned if all of that had to come from the other side of the world and nothing was being manufactured in this country. But where I'm also concerned is where my thought process is going is bordering on racism in an unconscious way. And although I think there are very legitimate arguments against rejecting China economically, there's also very good arguments in letting it get on with the way it wants to run its own country, because I'm not an imperialist. The Chinese government want to do things within their own country. I'm quite reluctant to criticise that, but I'm also interested in my own thought process as to whether I'm bordering unconsciously into racism as well. So it's important to realise that it's complicated rather than really simple.
Sure. Life's tough. Unconscious bias question, first of the day.
So I'm a big fan of cryptocurrency, and I research it on a daily basis. But China was originally the biggest miner of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, and a lot of people could see that cryptocurrency in China was China's basically strength over the cryptocurrency and mining was I'd say a really kind of terrifying power that they could actually manipulate. However, recently they've decided to ban all the mining, and I believe that that's ultimately going to hurt China because they want to have more superiority in their currency. But do you think the same way? Do you think it's a bad idea for China to ban mining cryptocurrency?
Just before we carry on, just in case, do you want to explain mining in the context of Bitcoin?
Right, so yeah.
As opposed to mining in terms of lithium.
The short version. So basically,
mining
a cryptocurrency is basically where you get like a machine, and it basically makes like mathematical equations, and then every time it succeeds making those mathematical equations, you get a reward for that in the stake of money or digital money, and then they essentially call it mining because you're basically mining a block.
Yeah, got that? Right. So
could you
answer whichever one you can take this if you wish.
Yeah, can I take your question?
But louder, Flora.
Yeah,
louder.
Because I teach the business law, and also I'm an investor, whatever in stock owned in Bitcoin. And I'm not really sure when you read the Sumter Reddy, they always have an old saying. So all the Chinese bank, the government bank, is the make profit. So it means that the China government, they bank the Bitcoin, but the Bitcoin, the price, you can see the and the Chinese government, they bank the property, but also the house, the price, So you can see. But actually, when you look at the reason that behind why the Chinese government bank the Bitcoin, because in the China, they use now the digital money, no cash. It's all the money, no cash. So they order just the number to give you the number. So they try to use one decentralized system. So all your deposit just money. Whatever you transfer also is the same. Everything is online. This why they use this digital money. Digital money very easy to control by the government. Also, they could monitor all your transfer from in and out of the country. But the Bitcoin is some kind of the government you cannot reach. So that's why there is some kind try to the different currency system. So that's why the Chinese government, they don't like it. They try to ban the Bitcoin.
Do you think it will hurt the country long term though?
I'm not really sure. When you look at the debate from Wall Street, there always the debate. And somebody say that the Bitcoin is some kind of future or currency. But also when some from the money trade, the military, they say that the Bitcoin is a speculation. So it depends on you. If you don't invest, Bitcoin actually is so kind of no related to your business, no related to your daily life. But if you invest the Bitcoin, you could see you could earn the money, but also you could lose in one night.
Okay,
so you always
good.
have a debate.
I hope you all enjoyed that. Right. Lee, anything you want to pick up on?
Yeah, I want to respond to the China in Africa issue. I really don't think like Chinese or European are in the right position to answer this question. What we should ask is to ask African people. I have been to Kenya and to South Africa and to several African countries. Wherever I go, and they are quite happy with China's investment. They say, oh, Chinese projects are so efficient. They get things done very quickly. So like I said, I'm not in a position to say this is good or it's a right approach or wrong approach, but we should respect local people, how they perceived this approach.
You meet so many happy people. Must go on holiday with you one time.
I think I want to touch on that first and second question. Yeah, so I want to touch on that first and second question that we got, which is, firstly, I want to question, so there is kind of this idea that, well, China is obviously terrible. I don't have access to transcendent truth, whether or not this fact claim is true, but I do want to point out that little more than a decade ago, there was a state that repealed civil liberties, that basically conducted systematic human rights abuses, not only in its own borders, but other borders as well. And instead of sanctioning it, the UK was willing to basically undergo a foreign intervention with this state. So I want to question the fact claim that China seems uniquely terrible. Again, I think there is very severe things that we do need to be concerned about. But this is also presents not only an opportunity to be critical of the actions happening in other states, but also the actions that we are complacent in within our own borders and the allies that we currently have now. And I think even if there are very severe moral and ethical issues that we need to grapple, and I don't want to undermine how severe they truly are. Like there was an allusion to the Cold War, so let's continue that allusion. Was McCarthyism the correct response to go on about it, right? Which is that often very strong geopolitical tensions that do have very strong ethical implications also have the ability to damage not only people from other states, like Chinese academics, but also your own people that are accused of sympathies with, for example, in the Cold War, communist academics or artists with communist sympathies. So note that it is the geopolitical discussions and ethical discussions we have not only damage people from over there, but also people within our state. For example, lots of xenophobia definitely impacted British Chinese people, and just British Asian people in general. And so it's really important that we understand how to frame these questions, not so much as this is a unique problem that China faces and they are an existential threat that we must defend against, because that has very real ramifications to how we treat people on the ground. Rather, how can we frame a discussion about ethical questions that we not only need to apply to China, but every allyship that we have, also like accountability to our own government. So I think there's lessons that we can learn from history about how to treat people and how to treat these kinds of ethical problems in a way that do not have like huge amounts of collateral damage.
Very nicely said. Very nicely said. Thank you very much. Right, lots of hands now, typically. You're a latecomer. Hang on. Latecomers, don't jump the queue. Right, I'm going to the back.
A question about Biden versus Trump in relation to US-China relations. I don't know how true this is, but it's been suggested that Trump, because he was so bullish and so blunt about American interests, was seen as a bit of an accidental hero in actually linking certainly the US with Russia, but particularly the US with an attempt to soften the Korean dispute and also with relation to China. Is that true? And is there a sense in which Trump's approach was actually healthier than Biden's?
Okay, hold that thought. I'm going to take a couple more questions. I don't know if you're writing these down. Well, I know you're not, actually. But take you, sir, and then you, and then I'll come this way.
Do you think the current energy crisis that China is currently experiencing will lead to a more pragmatic approach by the Chinese in terms of their relationships with other countries? I'm thinking about Australia particularly. They've had a ban on the buy of Australian coal, which they are sort of circumventing at the moment. But do you think they might actually become more open and things might actually improve?
Okay, very good. Yes, you, Tracy.
We talked a little before, in particular, actually talked a bit about integration between the West and China. Interesting. But whenever I speak to geopolitical experts in this area, they're talking to me about something called Dragon Bear, which is about China getting much closer to Russia and Iran when it needs to, and potentially actually in the future even Turkey, versus the US and this potential bifurcation. And that there's an assumption that it's the US in the future that potentially wants to decouple. But actually what they're saying to me is China has always been more prepared for decoupling, and actually in some senses wouldn't mind it in the future, and that's partly why they're taking the technology back. I'd be really interested in you, well, the whole panel actually, but really interested in your point of view about future decoupling and who's better prepared for it.
Okay, I've got that. I'll take you, madam, and then I'll come to the panel, and then I'll come on this side, yeah?
I'd like to know how historical issues...
Bit louder,
How are historical issues dealt with in China? How do you teach children about the Great Famine right now? Tiananmen Square, and also the harvesting of executed criminal workers. Are those issues actually ever discussed in China?
Okay. Some panellists may not wish to address that, but bear with us this side. Hold fire. We'll come back. Did you hear that question, by the way?
No.
It's very, very softly spoken, madam. It was basically, how do they teach history, in effect, in China? And do they leave bits out, those awkward bits, Tiananmen Square and what have you? Okay, who wants to have a bash? And answer whichever question you want.
Okay.
And I'll come back on the
I maybe just counter the integration.
Yeah.
Actually, from the stock market and China, they connect with London. And in the future, they will connect with the US. Okay, this is the stock market. When you talk about the company, the technology, and actually, in these 2 years or few years, the China invests a lot of money to build their own chip, the factories. I have looked this. There's some kind of they cannot really reach this level like the Apple or TSM from the Taiwan, the company, yeah. But they somehow in the middle level, showing me that at the moment, really, that if you in terms of high technology, they cannot, they're different level. But because China they invest a lot of money, they also like the Huawei, the US they bank the Huawei, but the Huawei they give like really the bonus to the whatever the people you come whatever, they give a lot of money to you 1 year. So they try to recruit all these talented people from whole world. So maybe in the 5 and 10 years, I mean in terms of technology, they could this gap could be narrow. Yeah. Yeah, and also I want to talk about a little bit Donald Trump, that one. and if you use the website a lot, actually the Chinese people, they call Donald Trump is a secret friend. Because Donald Trump make mess with other countries. So really put China in the global war a little bit advantage. The enemy is the friend. So something like this. But in the Biden, like I said, the Biden, this tension between the US and the China, you could see a little bit okay at the moment, because whenever they try to have a summit, or they also now that the US they are just released some of the bill, they say that okay, they allow the Huawei to buy the chip from the US, but in the Trump there is the stop. But now they open the market for the US for the Chinese company. So I mean the relationship, in particular, in terms of the business, this relationship is much better than in Trump administration.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Yeah, regarding the energy issue, I think what China is facing is not unique, because most other countries also facing the energy issue, because there are many good renewable energy like wind, like solar, but those are highly dependent on the weather, right? So what Chinese government is trying to do is still combine using some traditional coal mine generated energy and the renewable energy, but there should be balance, right? But now apparently the balance is not so well controlled. That's the short of the energy currently. Yeah.
The question was, would the energy crisis actually sort of lead to a more pragmatic view to some of their sort of neighbours regarding sort of saber rattling and things like this? Would it actually do it have the potential to actually improve relations?
Well, I'll chip in and say it doesn't look like it yet. I mean, the reason why they banned Australian coking coal was because Australia cast aspersions on the Wuhan origins of the virus, which then pissed off the government, and then they put a blockade on the coal. It wasn't as simple as that, but that's a fact, right? Oh, of course, of course. There's all kinds of hidden stories here, right? But then, of course, that means that the market for coal opens up, which means that America is now selling its coal to China rather than selling it to Europe, that Russia is selling its oil to China rather than to Europe. That's why we have an energy crisis, because it's now being redirected. So it's a global market and a global dilemma. Whether that opens things up and harmonizes, or whether that closes it down and becomes more tense, I mean, all bets are off. And the fact that there's that, what's it called, the AUKUS nuclear sub thing, where Australia and America and the UK are trying to get into bed together, circumventing their relationship with China, all that's going to play into tensions as well. So it's a bigger nightmare to worry about than you delicately phrased it. Jacqueline.
Yeah, so I think I want to address like the first two questions that we got. I think that the second question was about Biden versus Trump's approach to China containment. As a journalist, I'm not a specialist in international relations, but I can probably just give you a story that's interesting to I think chew on if you want to think about how those two different administrations have impacted UK domestic policy. So a few years back, Confucius Institutes were the hot thing to discuss, whether or not they were meddling in student politics, whether or not they were suppressing free speech on campus, whether or not they were basically just arms of the CCP in the UK and the US. And so it was a huge issue under the Trump administration, and the FBI director actually painted Confucius Institutes as a huge threat to academic freedom and freedom of speech. As a result, I think all Confucius Institutes, at least in most US colleges, were shut down as a result. That fear and anxiety definitely was imported into the UK as a result. I think the Conservatives commissioned a white paper looking at Confucius Institutes, where they collected evidence from many institutions, from many different lecturers about whether or not they believe Confucius Institutes had a malicious effect on freedom of speech. So interestingly, this is just evidence of how even things that happen within the US can definitely inspire a lot of domestic policy and how we choose to think about issues. See, like we didn't organically think about, maybe Confucius Institutes aren't a great idea because of all this evidence that we collected from UK lecturers of our own volition, but rather we seem to take the lead on what the US thinks are huge issues as instigators of what we believe are huge issues in the UK. So it's interesting to think about how different administrations in the US can lead to different tacks taken in the UK about approaching Chinese research and collaboration in academia especially. And I think there was another mention of a Manchester Conservative politician. Good luck contesting Manchester seats as a Conservative, but I think it is interesting because probably this is a British citizen of Chinese origin, so probably not too relevant on, discussions about China, but it is interesting how we seem to see the Chinese diaspora, people who are ethnically Chinese but who have otherwise lived in the UK their entire lives, seem to still be connected with China. And China does definitely make a lot of very public statements about how it claims ownership over many parts of the diaspora. So it's interesting how, for example, like even a normal Chinese politician contesting, I think it's Withington, is seen to be part of the larger China discussion, even though he's probably just a British citizen who has Chinese ethnicity. Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting.
Very, very useful. Okay, look, we've not got much time left, so short, sharp, punchy points from this side of the room. You're in the wrong end, mate. I'll come back to you in a minute. You, sir, and I'll come across, and then that you. Hopefully we'll get to you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about, in China there's a social currency where basically if you adhere to the state's rules, you can gain in that currency and you can lose it if you are not compliant. A point system that kind of makes people gives social credit. And I'm wondering, do you think that the West is following in systems like that when we, for example, we are instituting vaccine passports? In New Zealand this week, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, said that this will create a tiered system where one group is able to do things that the other group isn't. Do you think we are following in that process, and is there a way to identify and counteract it?
Very good question, thank you. Right, you, sir, you, madam. These be very quick, punchy points. You two, then you, then you.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the Africa thing. You met a lot of happy Africans in response to the Chinese investment and stuff. It is investment, but it's imperialism in another form as well, isn't it? In the sense that there are some big debts growing in Africa because of those, and that is going to come home to roost in some form or another. So it's going to cause a problem for a lot of Africans, I think. And on a similar point, on the Silk Route, Silk Road, Silk Ribbon, whatever you want to call it, I was reading recently that I think I'm behind the times on this, but it's come right into Germany now, hasn't it? Into Duisburg, I think it is, which was a bit of a rundown sort of Rust Belt town in Germany, which is now more or less not been taken over by the Chinese, but has been heavily financed by the Chinese. I think it's just really fascinating that how the tentacles of that, I don't want to make China out to be some kind of sea monster, but how the influence has stretched right into the heart of the most powerful country in Europe,
I wanted to start by saying I think a state's first role is to feed its people, and I think China is feeding its people and helping its people economically develop the same way as Europe has. But I wanted to ask whether it's, a lot of my friends seem to believe that China has said because the West was imperialist and burnt coal and fossil fuels, therefore China has the right to do that. And if that is true, I do struggle with the Chinese state making that statement, because when the rest of the world was burning fossil fuels, we had much less knowledge than we do now. So I sympathise with China feeding its people economic development. Countries spy on each other all the time and try to do each other down. That is just history. But I did wonder whether that is just a rumour going through my friends, who, because they're very nice and liberal, think that's actually perfectly all right, whereas I think it's not perfectly all right. And Africans might just hold all white tourists one summer and say, well, you got where you did with slavery, so we'll have you locked in and enslave them. So I sort of wondered whether that was true, and a sort of theme running through China, that it can do what it likes to catch up.
Good. You, sir, that lady, and we might have to take you for a pint.
Yeah, just a quick one. I'd like to ask the panel about what they think of wolf warrior diplomacy, the causes, consequences, and the term itself.
Yeah, wolf warriors.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring back to Dr. Lee's point about when she asked Chinese people, said they were happy, and how China, I don't know much about Chinese society, but they seem like they have quite strong values in a lot of the community, family, ambition, which has done a lot for them and a lot for the people. And whether you think that there's any way that Britain and the West can and should embrace these values in a positive way, detached from the state, but as the way that their society is formed.
Okay. The reason people are leaving is not because we're boring, it's because I'm overrunning. So, short, punchy answers, if you could, please.
Okay, I will quickly wrap up what you point out. Indeed, I'm not saying China is like a very good, perfect country. There are many challenges China is facing, like the inequality between the countryside and the city. There are huge wealth difference gap, and also the regional difference. Like in the UK, we would say in the north maybe is underdeveloped compared to south, and in China inland China is totally underdeveloped compared to the coastal part of China. So there are so many challenges China is facing, and like I said, it's quite good to learn from each other, to learn from like welfare system in the UK or in Germany. And while maybe there are some positive things, like China is very, very collectively oriented, but here is very, very individually oriented. So maybe there are some things in the middle for us to work together. Thank you very much.
As harmonious conclusion. Flora.
Okay, yeah, I just say a little bit related to the African country, the debt. Actually, I know that now China invests a lot of money to build a road, build a bridge, and build a house, and build a lot of the railway in African countries. And a lot of people also criticize that they maybe put this African country in a huge debt. But how can you see that all the investment you could see that they have a double side? So it brings the job opportunity, or it brings the money to your country, but also that maybe you also have a concern that how to pay back the money. I worked in the UN before. Actually, the UN, in particular, in the COVID, they have a lot of the program called the debt relief. So ask some country, if you're very powerful country like China or the EU or US, you maybe have to relieve some of the debt from the African country. So I think this the debt maybe not only for the China's issues, it's some kind of global issue that they need more the cooperation from the UN to talk about how to help the developing country, in particular some kind of Caribbean or African country, help to make everyone better.
Thank you very much. Jacqueline.
Yeah, very short, snappy on that first question. I'm actually a technology reporter, so this is a great question about the social credit system in China. Actually, I want to point out that lots of countries in the West innovated credit. It's just called credit. It's based on postal code, whether or not you've inherited debts from other people, et cetera, et cetera. I think China has made it far more wide-reaching in terms of using indicators for social behavior as well as economic behaviors. But if anything, it is because it has far more infrastructure to support that wide-reaching kind of system. And if anything, as the UK, as the rest of the world continue to increase that technological infrastructure, there's huge potential that these kinds of systems that we see currently in China will be implemented in the rest of the world as well. For example, currently, do you know that many councils in the UK determine your access to welfare based on indicators like how many dependents you have, whether or not you claim disability, whether or not you are a single working parent, etc. So this is a very real threat that many countries currently face as technology infrastructure gets more and more sophisticated. On how to combat that, be very tech literate, read lots of tech news, follow lots of organizations like Big Brother Watch that talk about these tech issues, the encroachment on privacy. And if you feel like it is something to worry about, be politically engaged. I think that's a good wrap up.
Very good. I'll just ride in on the back of that applause. Just to say that when I was driving with a friend of mine in Suzhou in Jiangsu in China, he drove through a red light and there was a ping on his phone. And basically the cameras had recognized his registration number and fined him through his bank, which came on his telephone within a split second. And at one time it was magnificent, and at another time it was terrifying. So we don't do that yet in the UK, but yes, it's on the cards. Secondly, I would only say about imperialism and what's going on in China, obviously just remember the fact that the IMF, the World Bank, has been screwing the third world for 75 years, and before that we had colonialism. And so, China's doing some terrible things in Africa. We appreciate that. They're doing some terrible things within its own borders. But you have to put these things in perspective of a developing country, which China still is, compared to the developing world, which is now lauding it over China, telling them that they shouldn't do it, even though we maybe did and benefited from it. And I think the final thing to say is that it's not, I don't call it imperialism, even though they've gone now, I think, but it's not imperialism, it's kind of much more a colonial. And when Britain ruled Africa for 150 years, right, it gave them pretty well bugger all. But at least China, which has this kind of weird thing of saying they have a policy of non-interference in the business of foreign countries, they are building roads and hospitals and schools and goodness knows what. Now, that may be a sop, but at least it's a damn sight better than colonialism ever gave them. So I'll give them a one-hand clap for that. Thank you all very much for that. Next session starts in 5 minutes.